by members of the previous Liberal government that changed the entry point from early French immersion. The Minister of Justice is one of the members of the former Liberal government that fought in court to change the early immersion entry point. In fact, I think there was a standing vote here where they all stood up and said, we're going to change it, Mr. Speaker. Well, here we go again. Can the Minister explain to the House what evidence there is that caused him to change his mind and support the Premier's political decision to change the early immersion entry point back to grade 1? Can one Minister, Mr. Speaker, stand up with a reason? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Premier.
The Leader of the Opposition should be aware that every time he tries to use the same catchphrase, you can't get more political than that. So I ask him to stop calling it a political decision after I've answered about 50 times that this is a decision based on a report that was commissioned by the previous government in which he was the Minister of Finance. And Mr. Speaker, I have to ask him again, why is he advocating at times that we have to completely overhaul and change the system because in his opinion education is broken and in crisis in New Brunswick? But then in the same day, Mr. Speaker, he'll then say that we need stability. So, Mr. Speaker, I have to go to this question because of that, because of this consistent two-way talk, Mr. Speaker. He has a fixation on French immersion. There's no doubt about it. So can I then at least assume that he agrees with everything else in our 10-year education plans? He thinks that the plans are solid because he has some very strange fixation with French immersion, so I have to think that the rest of our plans are great. Is not? Are they?
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, denial is always the hardest thing to overcome. Our system is broken. We can fix it, but we can't fix it by being in denial. Our statistics show that we are, ninth in the country? But we're denying that. Our system shows we're in every category falling behind. Our system shows less than 10% of the kids are graduating being fully bilingual after 45 years. What is wrong? We won't listen to the teachers. We invent policies right here and think we're doing better because it attracts a vote here, it attracts a vote there. Mr. Speaker, the 10-year plan needs a whole lot of work, but I want to be part of a 10-year plan and sign off on it now. So we won't mess with it in the future. No government will mess with it in the future. But no, we can't focus on that. We create a political decision that was made up after the 10-year plan. Wasn't even part of the 10-year plan. So how do you rationalize that other than politics, Mr. Speaker? I would say to the Premier, let's get together on a 10-year plan. Let's scrap this notion that teachers want to have more confusion in their room because they do not. Let's focus on 10 years.
The Honourable Premier.
Not sure where to start, Mr. Speaker. Again, I don't understand why he doesn't get it. The opposition was invited to participate in the development of the 10-year education plans. I apologize to the Leader of the Opposition if during his caucus meeting he didn't raise his hand to say I'd like to be a part of it when they were trying to decide who would help us, Mr. Speaker. They had members of the opposition give us advice and play a part in the 10-year education plans. Mr. Speaker, he then says that, well, the 10-year education plans need a whole lot of work. I have to ask, Mr. Speaker, if the 10-year education plans need a whole lot of work, quote, end quote, as the Leader of the Opposition would say, why is he so fixated on French immersion? Why would he not bring up some of his other concerns, Mr. Speaker? All he has done for the last 12 question periods, 14 question periods, is say that the system is broken, the system is in crisis. He has no solutions other than to cut in education and to have some sick fixation with French immersion, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Fredericton West Hanwell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Premier seems to want to hear some of other concerns about education, so I'm happy to raise some of those here for him today. And since he's been taking the questions on education, maybe he'll take some of mine. But I'd like to know just generally, what does the Gallant government see as the role of the District Education Council in determining the capital investment priorities of the government?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll allow the Minister of Education to get into the detail of the question. I have to say, I just hope the New Brunswickers watching can see the opposition. And this is what they do every day, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition's criticizing us and is upset that I'm getting up taking his questions, Mr. Speaker, and then we have the critic, one of the critics, get up and say that, well, no, he wants me to take the questions, Mr. Speaker. It's just ironic. I mean, we are working as a team over here to ensure that we make the right investment. to make the right investments for our economy and social fabric. And Mr. Speaker, in our opinion, there is no better investment that we can possibly make than in education. It helps our economy, it helps our social fabric, and is by far the best way we can give opportunity to all New Brunswickers. Unfortunately, the Leader of the Opposition is convinced there's enough money in education. He wants to cut like he did previously. Well, Mr. Speaker, we don't, and we're going to invest more.
Member for Fredericton West Hanwell.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I asked a very straightforward policy question, and I got nothing but obfuscation from the Premier today. Now, yesterday, the Premier and his government tabled their capital budget, and that lays out all the projects, the building projects. Mr. Speaker, that, as you know, that lays out all the building projects for the coming year. But on the 27th of October, the Anglophone School District West District Education Council made a recommendation to government. And that suggested that the two top priorities in that school district be improvements at Leo Hayes High School and a new school in Hanwell. And I'd like to know, Mr. Speaker, why that wasn't reflected in yesterday's capital budget.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Working with the District Education Councils, it's a local approach where we look at capital projects throughout the province. Mr. Speaker, I have to say I have met with many of the DECs throughout the province, and yesterday we tabled our capital budget, which is an increase, I think, we increased 3.1%, I think the year before. We have a good capital project coming up with many schools that are in the details to come, Mr. Speaker. But when the Education Councils were introduced, Mr. Speaker, the intent was to take a community approach to educating by putting decisions with the District Education Councils, and part of the process is that we'll do public consultation to move forward with these projects, Mr. Speaker. And our long-term approach for major capital projects, it's transparent in the consultative process, Mr. Speaker, to be able to apply to schools and schools equally throughout the province. So, Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to work on this year. When we make the final decision, we'll discuss it with the legislature, and Mr. Speaker, and the member can ask those questions.
Prime Minister. Member for Fredericton West Hanwell.
Well, no surprise, Mr. Speaker. I've asked a question of the Premier. I got bluster. I asked a question of the Minister of Education. Again, I got bluster. The fact remains the District Education Council is elected specifically to provide recommendations to government on these matters. They made that recommendation in October, in time for the capital budget process. And yet those recommendations are not reflected in the budget that was tabled yesterday. So the Minister says he's going to consult. The Minister says he's transparent. I'd like some consultation. I'd like some transparency now. They made a recommendation, Mr. Speaker. It was very clear. It was part of the process. Yet their recommendation, the recommendation of an elected board that's put in place, elected by the people, to provide those recommendations, that wasn't reflected in the budget. So, Mr. Speaker, what's the plan? Are we going to see that in next year's budget? When is there going to be a school for Hanwell? And when are we going to see improvements to Leo Hayes High School?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
See, Mr. Speaker, that you hear the opposition complain every time about cuts here. Now we have a member so fixated to make sure that he can get something in his own respective riding, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, the member will have the time when it comes up in the estimates coming up. He knows exactly how this works in the legislature. We tabled our capital budget yesterday, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to make record investments in midlife upgrades throughout the province, Mr. Speaker. There's a fair process that this has to go through. It's very detailed, and we'll work with our district education councils on that, Mr. Speaker. But the member opposite is looking for more and more and more and more, yet on the other hand he's saying that we're spending too much money. So what is it, Mr. Speaker? We were really confused on this side of the House from the members opposite asking questions about paving their streets, building their new schools. They want everything, but when it comes time to us tabling capital budgets, we say, well, we're spending too much money. Which way is it, Mr. Speaker?
Member for Southwest Miramichi Bay Devin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This deal for Enbridge brings a lot of uncertainty for New Brunswickers, 12,000 gas customers. The government is following the advice of Enbridge, and it appears most customers don't know what's coming. I doubt most of them are aware that Enbridge is currently seeking a 30% increase for 2017. I would like to ask the Minister if he has planned an adjustment in 2018 and 2019 if the current 30% increase Enbridge applied for in 2017 is accepted by the EUB.
The Honourable Minister of Energy and Resource Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm hoping my kids this year are going to get me some more sticky notes, because I'm using some sticky notes, because day 41, Day 41 since the agreement was announced in the capital, in the provincial capital, Mr. Speaker. November the 8th, the documents were tabled in the House. And, Mr. Speaker, of what we've seen so far from the opposition as far as questions go, the substantiveness of the questions in question period, along with what took place in committee, is deplorable, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, no questions about the bill. Talked about conflict of interest. They talked about the Enbridge lawyers. Talked about a salmon pool in the Miramichi, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, talked about confidential legal advice, and they were annoyed at the agreement, what it was called in our press release, Mr. Speaker. They even went as far, Mr. Speaker, the documents that we tabled in the House, they felt they should have been online, Mr. Speaker. They spent 20 minutes on that, Mr. Speaker. Can you imagine 20 minutes spending on that part of it?
Prime Minister, member for Southwest Miramichi Bay Devin.
Mr. Speaker, this is a party that tried to sell MB Power. This is a party where nobody knows where the money went from ATCON. This is a party that just gave a 50-year monopoly to Enbridge Gas, and this is a party who currently is being investigated more than once, and I expect more to come. Has the government been communicating with the 12,000 New Brunswickers who are Enbridge Gas customers? Do they know what might happen in 3 years' time?
The Honourable Minister of Energy and Resource Development.
Still, Mr. Speaker, no substance. And you know, maybe, Mr. Speaker, what happened a few moments ago, maybe we should get him some Kleenex or paper towel. Because while he was reaching for his phone to take a call from Craig Leonard, he spilled his coffee all over his desk. So it messed up his notes, Mr. Speaker. But I want to tell you something, a fact. I want to tell you something, a little fact, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a little something rather upsetting. Yesterday, during committee, Mr. Speaker, you know what he said to my staff? He said, "You're nothing but a bunch of liars." Is that the way to act in this House, Mr. Speaker? No, it's not. No, it's not. So I can tell you one thing, Mr. Speaker. The member from Fredericton West Hanwell had some substantive questions yesterday, Mr. Speaker. They make sense. We had a great conversation. As a matter of fact, there's leadership material, Mr. Speaker, as far as I'm concerned. So I don't know what's happening with the leader of the opposition, why he can't get a hold of his caucus members and say, look, we really need to drill down to the importance of what this bill is all about and what is taking place, Mr. Speaker. Quite frankly, to treat civil servants...
Member for Southwest Miramichi Bay Devin.
Mr. Speaker, the minister shouldn't be so sad. He's so upset today. What's wrong? You just gave your buddy, Mr. Hoyt, the 50-year monopoly. What are you getting out of the deal? That's what I want to know, Mr. Speaker. What's the minister getting out of this deal? What's the premier getting out of this deal? What's the Liberal Party of New Brunswick getting out of this deal? That's what we want to know on this side of the House. And you know what? My water spilled on me. You want to ridicule me for that? You should be ashamed of yourself, Mr. Speaker. The minister should be ashamed of himself here today. It's despicable. I want to know right now why they would sign a 50-year monopoly with this company. How's the investigations going anyway?
Minister of Energy and Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I ain't ashamed at all, Mr. Speaker, when I stand up in this House and answer that member, Mr. Speaker, the belligerence that he shows to civil servants and calling them liars. In the meantime, the leader of the opposition is supporting him. Think he's doing a great job, Mr. Speaker. Is this the new way of doing business, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, fact of the matter is that we haven't even had a chance to talk about the merits of the bill. The merits of the bill removes the financial risk of the lawsuit totaling more than $800 million, Mr. Speaker, without 1 cent of taxpayers' money. Helps stabilize rates for all sectors, including the commercial and industrial sector, provides some certainty against large increases to the customer class through the Energy and Utilities Board oversight, establishes rate caps of 3% for residential and 0% for commercial classes in 2018-2019, subjects any further rate increase to approval by the Energy and Utilities Board, providing rate hike protection in the same way that MB Power customers are...
The member for Riverview. I'm sorry, Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I want to respond here about we are very concerned about agreeing to a deal in very similar format as what was already proven to be a very poor business case done 20 years ago. So here we are, we're perpetuating a poor business deal. Why does this government have to raise taxes, about what, $500 million over the last year? Across every sector of this province? Why do we have to afford to afford their spending spree? Why do we need to do those things? Because we make such poor agreements. We make such poor deals. And I don't know whether it's just because of not understanding the deal. I don't know whether it's what influences this process, but it certainly isn't fact. And it certainly isn't a process that defies logic, that not makes sense. So our concern has been from the very beginning, why would you perpetuate a deal that is proven to be unsuccessful when it ended in 2019? It just doesn't make sense, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, for starters, the Leader of the Opposition, when he's the Minister of Finance, was a part of the government that ripped up a contract that made us potentially liable for $800 million, Mr. Speaker. And that wouldn't be the ratepayers, that would be New Brunswickers that would be on the hook for that, Mr. Speaker. We were able to, through negotiations, like the previous government tried to do, get an agreement. And it's a good agreement, Mr. Speaker. It's one in which we're going to have stable rates for New Brunswickers and for businesses. We're also going to have the EUB play its role in 2019, providing the appropriate oversight. I have to ask the member opposite, the Leader of the Opposition, though, if he wants to get up on his feet after what we just saw in terms of the questions, does he agree with his colleague in the way that he called some of the people working in the Department of Energy liars, Mr. Speaker? Does he agree with that? Does he agree with the member from Riverview asking the Minister of Finance how much it costs to print some laws on paper, Mr. Speaker? How much that costs the government? Does he agree with the way his caucus has been acting, Mr. Speaker?
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we offered a solution. Repeal our own bill. Repeal Bill 18. Just go back to square one as of 2012. And you know what that does? It resets the clock. I never believed this lawsuit was real or significant, and it would have been easily proven that it wasn't. But if it was such a concern, repeal Bill 18. Then what you've done is you haven't tied this province for the next 50 years. You haven't closed the market for customers in central New Brunswick and in the north. Where are they going to get gas from, Mr. Speaker? You've given a monopoly to a company and said, oh, that's okay, we're going to carry on with a business plan that was flawed from the very beginning. So is there a misunderstanding of business practices here with this government? Yeah, bad deals have been made forever, but at some point, you got to do better. We were prepared to repeal our own deal and support it, Mr. Speaker. It would have taken it all off the table. And then in 2019, you could negotiate a deal that was right for New Brunswick. Why would we not do that?
The Honourable Premier.
Monsieur le Président, l'argument du chef de l'opposition, c'est qu'on ferait en effet ça, enlever le projet de loi, Monsieur le Président, mais qu'est-ce que ça ferait? C'est que ça nous mettrait dans une position qu'il faudrait négocier quand même. Il faudrait quand même négocier, Monsieur le Président. Mais nous, on a fait ce que le dernier gouvernement ne pouvait pas faire. Ils ont essayé, eux, d'avoir une entente avec Enbridge. Ils n'ont pas pu le faire, Monsieur le Président. Nous autres, on a fait une entente qui va être bonne pour les gens du Nouveau-Brunswick, qui va être bonne pour notre économie, une entente qui va faire en sorte qu'on va avoir des frais qui sont stables. Et en plus, Monsieur le Président, nous allons avoir le EUB qui va jouer leur rôle dès 2019. And I have to ask the Leader of the Opposition today, I mean, he's getting up talking about spending sprees. He has his caucus members getting up talking about they want roads paved in their ridings, they want schools in their ridings upgraded or even new schools. Well, Mr. Speaker, although there's no consistency on the opposite aisle, there's consistency here. We're making strategic investments to grow the economy, ensure we improve education and health care in our province.